Thank you very much, Larry. I'm not sure there's much to add, except that I've spent a lot of my career in the private sector, so I haven't just been infected by academia, I want to assure you. And I've consulted for quite a range of different private sector companies, but really it's mostly been in the energy sector and in semiconductors. So not really specific to your industry, but I've also got in, that last talk was fantastic, and I appreciate that very much because I've got quite a bit of experience in antitrust as well, and I learned quite a bit. So putting together a presentation like this for an event like this is a little tricky because it's not really clear necessarily what aspects of the economy the audience will be interested in. There's so many different things to talk about, and that I should extend that into the world of finance as well. And so I've done my best to really put together a presentation that I think addresses some of the things that most of us are interested in today's world. The title of this, and there are two aspects of the title that I knew to explain, the post-pandemic recovery. If I really had, that much of a clue of what the trajectory of the economy was going to be once we get out of this, I would obviously be a very rich man. This is highly speculative. Anything that we have to say about where the economy is headed from here, we don't really completely understand the situation we're in right now. Our data is very noisy and messy due to what's going on as a result of the pandemic. So we can't necessarily even trust the data that we're seeing sometimes. And that means that if there's going to be a reckoning later where they go back and revise a lot of the data. And so some of the data that we've got now may not even really reflect the true reality, but we're going to do the best we can. Okay. And the other part of the title that there are really two more parts. There are three that I need to explain. The bifurcation of the US economy is something that was part of our discussion last year, and something that is now becoming a more and more universal talking point throughout the economics profession. My term bifurcation, which was something I've been using for a while. I'm not going to say that I invented this whole idea, I didn't, but the word bifurcation is being used to describe the economy a lot now, right? And it wasn't being used with nearly as much frequency last year when we had this discussion. The bifurcation into for very crude terms that I'm going to describe here, the haves and the have-nots, right, has been exacerbated, as I'm sure most of you are aware, been exacerbated by the pandemic. And it's made the prospects moving forward look substantially more pessimistic, but also a lot more uncertain. So the special K part of this was my attempt at humor, to the extent we can have humor about something like this. But you may have heard of one of our the current sort of investment bank caricature is that we're in a K-shaped recovery. We started out with, are we going to have V-shaped? Are we going to have W-shaped? Right? Are we going to have a Nike swoosh? These were the things that were being discussed, and that those terms became sort of talking points in the financial press. The K shape is the most recent one, and that basically means we've got two separate economies, and you can see it, right? We've got one where the economy seems to be really doing very well. Look at what the stock market is doing, okay? And yet we've got another aspect of the economy that can only be described as being on a downward trajectory, okay? So they're essentially, the bifurcation is inherent in that sort of characterization. There are two parts of the economy. One seems to be thriving even through the pandemic, and maybe as a result of the pandemic. The other one is clearly suffering. Okay, so we'll start out, these are the topics we're going to discuss, and we'll start out with this discussion of the labor market because that's where a lot of the pain is most evident, right? And there's a reason for this. I mean, these are markets we're talking about, right? And if labor markets are not strong and earning power is not maintained, then people aren't going to have money to spend. And spending is what drives the economy, right? And it drives every aspect of the economy. And obviously, having disposable income is going to be a very important part of the success of your own industry moving forward. So before we even get to the labor market, this is a graph. The purple line is a graph of US real GDP. As usual, I pulled my graphs from the Fred database. So because they have a graphing tool. So they're not always the most professional looking things in the world but it's very easy to use. And I will elaborate on them in the slides. There will be other things added to them. So the purple line is US real GDP. Of course, this is how we measure our success as an aggregate economy. Going back to Q1 2006. So the gray area is a recession, right? That's the Great Recession, okay? Global financial crisis. The yellow is also a recession. The reason why it's in yellow is because we haven't really determined the dates, beginning dates and ends of the recession yet. That is determined by a committee at the National Bureau of Economic Research, who has been charged by the government with deciding when recessions start and end. We don't know. I mean, no other recession has looked like this one, okay? And normally recessions are called when you have 2 consecutive quarters of negative real GDP growth, okay? Then a recession starts, and they have other criteria that they can use to date them, but every single recession they've dated has had that criterion met, okay? Well, we've got obviously we had two consecutive quarters of negative real GDP growth as a result of the pandemic as well. But then we had a massive, what appeared to be a massive recovery, right? We fell 35%, and then we went back up about 25% after that. Of course, the increase of 25% after falling 35%, those two can't be compared. So we're still a long way off from recovering, and we don't really know what the true dates of the recession are going to be. That'll come to, we'll be informed of that later. What I've done here is drawn a linear trend projecting out, and this is related to material we talked about last year. Okay, here, this top gray dotted line here, that was the trajectory that the economy was on. Now, I can project out a linear trend. That doesn't say that we would have necessarily been on it, okay? But most of our projections of economic growth and the performance of the economy are, going to come up with a similar picture, okay? It's not going to be too far different from some highfalutin forecast that somebody put together back in, say, 2005, okay? And so notice, and this is what we talked about last year, we haven't come anywhere close to we're getting back to our previous trend, okay, after the Great Recession. And then we got hit by this pandemic, right? Maybe this is a new linear trend. We got a long way to go before we get back on there, okay? So, I don't know what's going on with the stock market today, but last I looked, it was up again, okay? The stock market is just shrugging these things off. Okay, all of the indices, particularly the ones that are comprised of large companies, have been sort of trending upwards through this entire period. Okay, at the same time, the bottom has fallen out of the economy, and we've got an awful long way to go to recover. So we'll start out with that as our sort of basic premise. We have fallen substantially below the potential of the United States economy, right? And we got a long way to go to get back there if we ever really get back on these previous trajectories, and that's highly doubtful. So let's start with some of the bad news. And these are weekly unemployment claims. Okay, these are the unemployment claims due to the pandemic. This period here at the beginning of the time period, that's before the pandemic starts, right? And then pow, starting in March, right, we start to get massive layoffs. Lots of people losing their job. We had initial unemployment claims. These are new claims each week. Okay, we've never seen anything like this before. It was a massive increase. And look at the red line I've drawn here. Reflects the previous high, right? We've been giving unemployment benefits, and the data is out there going back. I wish I could tell you the exact answer. At least until the 1970s. Okay, and we haven't come anywhere near where we hit during the pandemic. Okay, but it's come down. It's come down substantially. We're now right about where we were in the last at the last high. Another week's data has come out since I put this slide together, and it's gone up again, okay, but just slightly. But that's not necessarily reflective of the true pain that we're seeing. This is continued claims. These are people who were going back to the well week after week after week in some cases, okay? In fact, in a lot of cases during the pandemic. So you can see here we are before the pandemic here. This shoots up, comes down relatively slowly, and has remained high, right? We're not at our previous record, but these are people who have lost their jobs and have not gotten them back. And they're continuing to be able to go back to the well. This is, the jobs have not come back, right? And this is the reason why we've had the extensions of unemployment insurance passed by the last stimulus or recovery or whatever you want to call the last package passed by Congress, extended unemployment benefits by $300 a week. And they suspect that that may be responsible for part of the increase that we saw this past week, because, in some states, if you're earning unemployment benefits, if you were, say, you weren't working a lot, then, you could be earning $50 a week, right, in unemployment benefits. And obviously you can't survive on that. So a lot of people weren't even bothering, apparently, to apply. But once the $300 supplement got in there, then we saw the numbers go up again that weren't necessarily reflective of job loss. So it looks like some people have gone to apply, and that's good because that's increasing their purchasing power, their earning, that gives them money to spend. And as we just talked about, it's spending that drives the economy. Okay, permanent and temporary job losses have also exhibited a pattern we've never seen before. Massive amount of layoffs occur. These are the temporary. Okay, this is going back just 1 year now. Okay, and so a massive amount of layoffs. Right, these are temporary, but they've become more permanent. Okay, over time, more and more of those temporary layoffs have become permanent job losses. Here it is by percent. This is out of the unemployed. The percentage of the unemployed that were on layoff was once almost at 80%, and the permanent was down here about 10. Okay, but over time, that percentage of permanent job losses has increased. It has tailed off a little bit, but that's just 1 month's data. We'll see whether that trend continues. But of course, this is not good news, right? If you're moving people, and notice it doesn't add to 100% because some people don't know. All right, but the people who do report knowing whether they're on temporary layoff or whether they're going to be laid off permanently, they're answering the survey. This is all based on survey evidence. The data, I should just let you know, the data source between this and between this are different. Okay, this is the states administer unemployment claims, right? So this data all comes from the states, and they submit it to the Department of Labor, and then they put it into an aggregate data set. And you're probably aware that this data has been a mess, right? They have had to go back and revise a lot of this. A lot of the states were, not really keeping up with the data. A lot of states, and this is also underreporting the number of people who are truly unemployed, because this went on for 6-8 months in some states. Their unemployment insurance systems were overwhelmed, and people couldn't get benefits. There are stories of people that went 6 to 8 months just trying to get through so they could apply for unemployment benefits, and they were unable to in certain states. Then we have the fraud problem. California had to shut down their unemployment insurance system for 2 weeks. They didn't give any benefits at all because they were having to root out the fraud that was coming in with all of this. And this is a reflection of the fact that they're overwhelmed. They do this stuff all the time. They catch fraud all the time, but they've never had to deal with this magnitude of unemployment claims. Okay, so this is the net effect. This is employment. This is non-farm employment, which is the way we categorize private sector employment in a meaningful way in the US economy. Okay, payroll employment. Again, we're going back to before the last recession, and it was increasing as it does over time. As the population and the economy grow, employment is going to grow as well. Right? And then you go into a recession and it falls off a cliff. People lose their jobs. As the economy recovers, and we've been in a recovery ever since, Okay, I mean, there's no, one of the things that I try to do in these types of discussions is, you call it myth busting. And we talked about this last year as well. There's been so much sort of in your face promotion about how amazing the economy has performed. Well, it's performed exactly the same it was performing beforehand. We've been on an upward trend, and that trend continued until the pandemic hit. But this is a massive amount of jobs to lose in any economy. Okay, and it has partially recovered, but that recovery has essentially come to a halt now. Okay, and that is, again, not good, right? We need to get through this. We need to get some sort of level of immunity built up throughout the population so that we can begin going out again and engaging in economic activity. Here's the unemployment rate. Okay, again, I mean, you just don't see pictures like this historically. I've been doing this a long time. Okay, so the actual unemployment rate as registered by the current population survey, which is conducted by the Department of Labor, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which is the statistical arm of the Department of Labor. Every month they survey households, and they follow the same households for 5 months at a time typically, and then those households drop out. And then, so it's an overlapping cohort type of a thing. And that's where our official headline unemployment rate data comes from. Okay, household surveys. And you can see unemployment goes up in recessions, right? And then it came down steadily. It's been a continual recovery in the unemployment rate all the way until the pandemic. And then, of course, the massive spike, right? And then it's come down substantially as many states have opened up their economies, but it's leveled off again. And we've reached a point where we don't know how much improvement we're going to get in the future. Now, what's this little insert box I've got in here? When the pandemic started, one of the more interesting things that happened from a data perspective is that the Dallas Fed started up something called the Pulse Survey, RPS. Retail Pulse. I can't even remember what the R stands for now. I get a weekly email updating the RPS. And they started their own survey because it was such an unusual circumstance. They started surveying households on their own and doing a separate survey weekly, right? And tracking some of the same things that we track in other surveys, but also other things as well. So you may have heard of the increase in food insecurity. That's one of the things that they followed in that Pulse survey, because so it's made the news. This is their real time. R is the real time thing. That's what the R and RPS is. So what this is showing is basically that we're not really sure what the unemployment rate is, because the RPS unemployment rate calculated using their survey is substantially higher than the official headline number. And you can see the difference here. The RPS number is in blue, and then the headline unemployment number is down here in black. Okay, and they're deviating quite substantially from each other. This is again a reflection of the fact that because the world has fallen apart, the world as we know it doesn't really seem to operate as it used to. There's a lot of noise in our data now that we're going to have to sort out. But there are other logical explanations for this. The economists that put together the RPS are very careful to make sure that they're pointing out why these differences may exist. And there are some, a lot of it is sort of statistical minutia that we don't really want to go into, but there are some of the logical explanations. For example, the samples are different. Okay, the CPS is a sample where they have tried to represent the American population before they even go out and survey. And to the extent they can't do that, then they weight the responses to make it look like the US population. The RPS is what we call a convenience survey. They're going through Qualtrics and getting people to answer, just requesting that people answer this survey. Now, the sample that they've chosen is still representative of the US population. Okay, but there are going to be important non-response issues and things like that are going to make the data different. Okay, and they're probably picking up more young people with lower incomes as a result. Another thing that they point out that's kind of interesting is that because the CPS follows the same households for 5 months, right, and if you answer yourself that you had a job in the last month, I was employed in the last month, you're done with that section. If you say you were unemployed, you have a whole bunch more questions to answer. And they suspect that people start to get sick of answering the survey after 4 or 5 months, and so they just say, yeah, I'm employed, even though they're not, because it means they don't have to put in so much time and effort completing the survey. Of course, we don't have any data on how prevalent that is, but anyway, those are the reasons why it may be different. But it's, again, reflective of the fact that we don't really know what the unemployment rate is now. Okay, we've got some indication, quite obviously, but there's, again, so much noise and so many strange things going on because of the pandemic that the data is noisy. Labor force participation rate. Okay, this is one of the things that drives the unemployment rate in a way that I'll explain to you on the next slide, and we actually talked about last year. The labor force participation rate is the fraction of the adult population that's eligible to work that's actually working or seeking work. So you're either employed or unemployed. And in order to be classified as unemployed, you have to be actively seeking work. If you're not looking for a job, then you're not in the labor force. Okay. And as people lost their jobs in the pandemic, they dropped out of the labor force, right? A lot of them did, as you can see. And this is, not good news for the economy. It is, however, good news for the unemployment rate. So when other things equal, when the labor force participation rate falls, the unemployment rate goes up. So that's an indication that the measured unemployment rate is artificially low. Again, something we talked about last year and something that's been true for a decade. It's not a new phenomenon now. But the fact that we've had so many people drop out of the labor force, some have returned, but we've gotten made no progress since then, after it fell precipitously for years. Okay, this is not good news. There are only two things that you can say cause an economy to grow and progress. You need people added to the labor force, and those people need to be getting more productive. Those two things together determine economic growth at the aggregate level. Productivity growth has been abysmal, and we talked about that last year too. Now the labor force growth has fallen off a cliff as well. Okay, both of these we're in for a long haul perhaps. Okay, so some of this is people retiring. If I was, I'm about 5 years from hanging up my hat here. If I was, say, 2 years away and I got laid off, right, I might just say, "Oh, the heck with it," right? Now I'm retired. Okay, so some of it is just choice, right? But a lot of it is not, right? A lot of it is just, I can't find a job. There are no jobs for me out there, so not even going to be bothered looking, or I need to stay home and take care of my sick family, or I need to just stay home to be safe because I've got a pre-existing condition. There are all kinds of these reasons, okay? And some of those may not go away as the economy recovers. So this gets a little bit more technical, okay? And over here, little u is the unemployment rate, okay? The unemployment rate can be decomposed into two things that then determine the unemployment rate. One of them is called the employment to population ratio, also referred to sometimes as the employment rate. But that's a little confusing because the unemployment rate doesn't have population in the denominator. So the BLS calls it the employment to population ratio. The OECD and the Eurostat, the statistical arm of the European Union, they call it the employment rate. It confuses people, but it won't confuse us. So the employment to population ratio tells you how many people have jobs as a fraction of the adult population that's eligible to work. Okay, and in February, before the pandemic started, that was 61.1%. Okay, as of December, it's fallen to 57.4 because people have lost their jobs. Okay, the labor force participation rate, which is what we looked at on the last slide, that's another determinant of the unemployment rate. February of 2021, before the pandemic, it was 63.3%. Now it's fallen to 61.5, or at least in December. Okay, you can easily show mathematically that you can derive the actual current unemployment rate. Oops, didn't mean to move that. The actual unemployment rate as a simple expression that involves these two things. Okay, and so I've done that with both of these. These are the actual unemployment rates. In December, it was 6.7. I can calculate that using these numbers, and in the spreadsheet, I did underlying this, but it gives me the exact same answer as I was just looking up the unemployment rate, of course. Okay, and it was the unemployment rate was 3.5. I can calculate that using these two numbers in February. Okay, but what's happened since February is that we've had a lot of people, as we saw, drop out of the labor force. They're not even being included in the unemployment rate anymore. They're not actively seeking work, but they're not working anymore. So that's what I mean by the unemployment rate can be a misleading indicator of the true distress in labor markets. And like I also said, that's been the case since the Great Recession. Right? Labor force participation fell, as you can see, continuously until about 2017, but it's never recovered to where it was. That's kept the unemployment rate artificially low because all of these people have dropped out of the labor force. They're not even looking for work, and therefore they don't count as unemployed people. So when we include them, okay, when we include those people, as I've done here, okay, I use the same employment to population ratio as we have for December, but now I've used the labor force participation rate from February, which assumes that all those people have been dropped out of the labor force that dropped out. And when I do that, I get a real unemployment rate of 9.3%. I'm calling it, just dropped my mouse, excuse me. Got a little excited there. It's supposed to say non-employment. That's a typo. You'll hear people refer to this sometimes as the non-employment rate, but that doesn't have a formal definition. Okay, so Lael Brainard, who is one of the governors of the Federal Reserve, gave a speech, I think, last week where she talks about just this phenomenon. She says the unemployment rate in the economy is not 6.7%. It's probably over 10%. And this is what she's referring to. She then went on to give some even worse news that I don't have data to show you on, that's more indications of the bifurcation of the economy, because she talks about how, according to the data that they've got at the Fed now, the bottom quarter of earners in the United States, the bottom quartile, the unemployment rate for those people is approximately 20%. Okay, and she thinks it's more like 5% for high earning people. Okay, so 20%, that's a massive amount. And those are restaurant workers, bar workers, movie theaters, things like that, right? That's a whole sector of the economy that's essentially disappeared because of the pandemic and doesn't look like it's fully going to come back for a long, long time after this. Okay. I guess somebody got a question. I got something coming through. Sorry, I thought somebody was talking. So again, we're just going to talk. I'm going to go through a grab bag of topics. If there's anything that's not here that you want to talk, I may know something about it. I'll give it my best shot. But one of the things that people are very concerned with these days, as they were concerned about it beforehand in a lot of cases, and now it's become that much more of a prevalent concern. Government deficits and debt. Right, we have been spending incredible amounts of money with fiscal policy. It's been monetary policy and fiscal policy. Okay, but the fiscal policy component has been large, and it just got larger with extended unemployment benefits. Okay, and that's going to have that obviously increased our government budget deficit substantially, and that has implications for government debt. So I'm going to show you, this is the pre-pandemic projection for the debt to GDP ratio. The debt to GDP ratio is how we commonly measure the debt burden of a country, government debt. Okay, so this is, government debt. In other countries, when they have it, for some reason, it's called sovereign debt if it's a European country, right? It's sovereign debt for all of them. It's government debt for all of them. It's the same thing, okay? For some reason, when Greece has a problem, it's called a sovereign debt crisis. When we have a problem, it's called a government debt crisis. So anyway, this was the pre-pandemic projection. When the Trump administration came into power, the debt to GDP ratio was about 70%. That put us right sort of in the middle of the pack with respect to the OECD countries. Those are the 44 largest market-based economies in the world. So in other words, it doesn't include China, it doesn't include India, but 44, it'll include Mexico. Right? And when you include all of those countries, we were right in the middle. We were right about the average of all of those countries, okay? Not dissimilar from where Germany was at the time. So the country at the top of the list was Japan. And Japan has been engaged in unusual stimulative economic policy since the 1990s because they've had special problems with demographics that we haven't quite gotten into yet. Our demographic problems are not nearly as bad as many other countries of the world, but they have an incredibly aging population. That tends to set in the forces of what we called secular stagnation last year. Spending falls, right? Retired people are living on fixed incomes. They don't spend as much money as younger people do. And so as the population ages, the economy tends to slow down, and Japan has been battling that since the 1990s. And they've been using government spending and monetary policy, but their debt to GDP ratio currently is about 240%, okay? Whereas ours was 70 before the Trump administration came in. The Trump tax cut started to increase it and increase it some more. The projection was for out to this goes out to 2050, I believe, was that we were going to surpass 100% substantially. And at the end of the model, this is the Congressional Budget Office's model, we were going to be at about 150% of GDP. It's a pretty substantial increase in the debt to GDP ratio. Here it is intra-pandemic, I suppose. Okay, this is a new forecast, right? It is relevant. Notice that it says September 2020, and yet the projection starts right at the end of 2019. That's because they don't have some of the data that they need. They have a lot of it. They know the pandemic is going on. Obviously, if they were only projecting things from 2019, they would have never known that. But they're starting, the model is starting the projection right here. They've got data on the future that they can use to calibrate that model, but they don't have everything they need to run their model. So they have to start at a date where they've got everything they need. That's all. Okay, and you can see now, I mean, who knows what's going on with this? That's all a reflection of their model, okay? But you can see now we're talking about 2050, we're talking about 200% of GDP as a result of the spending being done as a result of the pandemic. So it looks like, people see these diagrams and they think, the world's going to end, right? It's been a common. This is the debt to GDP ratio again, the actual, just up to the most recent data that we've got. So you can see the result of the tax cuts. It starts to increase already, but then it spikes up. Okay, like I said, this is a measure of debt burden. When I was a student, whether a graduate student or otherwise, we were always taught like we never learned the concept of debt sustainability for a government, which is something we discuss now. Why didn't we do that? Well, because economists were morally opposed to the idea of taking on debt. Okay. What's the sustainable level of debt? Zero, right? Everybody knows that. You shouldn't be in debt at all, right? And if you are in debt, you need to get rid of it. Well, we've changed substantially since then. And really, since the Great Recession, the vast majority of the economics profession has really come around to this viewpoint that having a high government debt level is not the end of the world and may be necessary in order to run an economy. Now, there are two different ways to tell that story. First of all, if Japan had not done what they did, they would be, most economists agree, they would be a quivering mass, a pathetic quivering mass, their economy right now. Their demand had fallen and they needed to stimulate it. The private sector was unable to do that. It required the Japanese government and the Japanese central bank, the Bank of Japan, to actually step in and do that. They've had to continue to do that for quite a while, which has ramped up their debt to GDP ratio above any other country in the world by a substantial margin. But their economy hasn't done badly at all. They haven't done as well as they did in the 1980s, but their living standards are very high for a country. Their financial markets have performed very well through this whole thing, right? It's not necessarily been detrimental to their economy. In the absence of those policies, they would have been in a much worse predicament than they're in now. Okay, and so you may have heard of I'm not going to go into this, this gets very controversial, but you may have heard of a new sort of theory in economics called modern monetary theory. It's controversial. It's not, I'm not an advocate of it. I don't understand it enough yet. It's brand new, and I think most economists will say that. They talk about, that we're overemphasizing this government debt problem, that government spending is a necessary component of any economy in order to keep the economy running efficiently. And it's that mentality seems to be correct in certain ways, and it's crept into the rest of the profession. Even if people didn't know what modern monetary theory was, we've changed our perspective on all of this, and we now teach our students about something called the sustainability of government debt. Now, there's a lot of words on this slide, just in case anybody wants to pick up more of this, but I'm not going to read it. I'm just going to tell you what I'm talking about. Right? Every country runs budget deficits, which means they have to issue debt. Right? Treasury securities are our debt, our government debt. They issue substantial quantities of that every year because we run a budget deficit every year. Is that sustainable? Don't we have to run a surplus someday in order to pay off that debt? Right? A more fundamental question that we ask now is that debt going to blow up? Okay, is it going to go to infinity, as we say in economics, over time? And the answer is, well, we can actually state a condition, okay, where debt will be sustainable in the long run. That is, it won't blow up, because you don't want to have a sovereign debt crisis. Now, that's what makes us and Japan different from Greece, different from Portugal, different from Spain, different from Italy, all the countries that suffered in the Southern European debt crisis that followed the Great Recession. They don't issue their own currency. Okay, they all have to be on the euro, which means that they don't have that extra flexibility of monetary policy to rely upon in order to support their economy. Okay, and that meant that when they started getting in trouble and didn't look like they were going to be able to pay back their debt in full, then speculators made a run on their currencies. Okay, they said, oh, well, your debt's not going to get paid back. Let's reduce that in value. Okay, I don't even need to own, they didn't reduce their currencies, they're on the euro. It reduced the value of their government debt substantially. Okay, they needed a bailout. Okay, and they got one from the IMF, the European Central Bank, and the European Commission combined to bail out those countries and get them back on a sustainable trajectory again. We don't have to worry about that here. Okay, if we're in a sovereign debt crisis, we're in a government debt crisis where it looks like we may not be able to pay back our debt, we can raise the money through monetary policy if we need to. And it's not like we haven't done that in the past. Okay, that's how World War II was essentially financed. Okay, so it does happen. And it used to be that we learned that this was a dramatic disaster for your economy. And it doesn't necessarily play out that way. And we've seen that as a result of the Great Recession. How many times have you opened up your Apple News feed, whatever it is you read, and you found some commentary from somebody about how hyperinflation is just around the corner? What the Fed is doing is going to cause hyperinflation, and we're going to look like Greece or Zimbabwe or Venezuela or something like that. And it never happened, right? It hasn't happened because they're misunderstanding the underlying dynamics of the economy in ways that everybody used to, but we've learned a lot over these past couple of decades. Okay, so what's this sustainability question? Right? What's the condition? Well, remember that when you get your W-2, it shows you your income, okay? And your taxes are based on that. Well, if we add up all the compensation in the economy, we get a measure of nominal GDP. That's one way to calculate GDP. Okay, so our wages, right? We add them all up in salaries, right? That constitutes GDP along with other forms of compensation. Okay, and our taxes are based on that. Okay, so long, and remember, we got to pay interest on our debt, right? If we can't pay the interest on our debt, that's going to make the debt unsustainable, quite obviously. But so long as we are taking in enough tax revenue to pay our interest obligations, we can continue to roll over that debt. I don't know why I keep knocking things off my desk. We can continue to roll over our debt, and the debt can be sustainable. So long as nominal GDP grows at a rate faster than the interest payment on debt and by a certain margin, then debt can be sustainable, and it's not going to blow up into infinity over time. It may go up over time, but it's not going to go up without limit. It's going to converge on something eventually. Okay, and so all we need is for excuse me, I got the wrong slide pulled up there. All we need is for nominal GDP growth to exceed the interest rate on debt, and then government debt is sustainable, and we never have to worry about a debt crisis of any sort, even if we didn't have our own monetary policy to solve it. This works for Greece as well. Okay, well, here it is, going back as far as I can go in time. Okay, and the green line is the growth rate of nominal GDP. That includes prices, remember. Okay, so GDP can go up for two reasons. Prices are going up and we're producing more stuff. That's nominal GDP. Okay, so the green line is the growth rate. The red line is I just chose the 10-year treasury yield, right? That's the biggest one out there, and it's reflective of kind of an average of all the rates. Okay, and you can see that for most of recent history, the green line has been well above the red line. Okay, what we're doing right now is not going to cause any sort of problems with a debt crisis, or we're never going to have to worry about the United States government being unable, even if we weren't willing to use monetary policy to solve this problem, we still would not reach a crisis. Here's another way to look at it, and a lot of commentators are advocating this to become our new metric for evaluating the burden of government debt. Debt to GDP is one thing, right? But it only takes you so far. Here's our interest obligations as a fraction of GDP, government interest payments as a fraction of GDP. And they haven't been as low as they are now since the 1950s. And this is when the Fed was engaging in what we call financial repression. In order to pay back the World War II debt, they were keeping rates low just for that. Right? Over here, we're not keeping rates low for a reason like that. We're keeping rates low because the economy seems to need very low rates. But that means that our interest payments on government debt are very low. Right? They're not burdensome. It's about 2.5% of GDP, and historically, that's a low number. Okay, so my basic lesson is there. Don't worry yourself too much about the government debt. We're not Greece, okay? And it's not going to tend to be much of a drag on the economy unless interest rates start to go up, okay? If interest rates start to go up, then that government debt burden is going to rise again. And that's what was going on in these previous decades right here, quite obviously, the 1980s being the period of very high interest rates. Okay, now I tend to try not to get too political in these types of things, but in the interest of myth busting, okay, we've got a new administration coming in. All right, you're hearing all kinds of stuff about, here come the tax and spend liberals again, right? Oh my God, we're already hearing noises about how even though, Congress has sort of ratified all of this spending as a result of the pandemic, that now that the Democrats are in control of Congress, where the Republicans are talking about enough is enough. Okay, we're going to cut that off. So we'll see. There's going to be political battles about all of that. But of course, everybody knows that deficits and therefore government debt are a Democrat problem, right? Not a Republican problem. And therefore, the Biden administration is going to be yet another Democratic administration that just blows up the deficit and the debt. Okay, and so I put together a chart at the request of somebody else. This is the change in the deficit to GDP ratio from the beginning of the presidential term to the end. Okay, so if you're paying down, if the deficit is going down, right, then the deficit to GDP ratio is going down. Okay, for the Trump administration, I didn't want to burden them with the pandemic. That doesn't seem fair. Okay, so I only did it through 2019, but you can see the results of the Trump tax cut already there. The deficit to GDP ratio went up. It went up during the Bush administration. It was essentially flat in the Obama administration. I think in this graph, I couldn't even make that bar blue because I couldn't actually click on it. So it's red hidden under there when it shouldn't be. The Clinton administration is known by economists to be, that's the administration when the deficit went down substantially. It went down so much that we stopped issuing 30-year treasury bonds. And we stopped issuing so much of the other varieties of treasury debt as well, to the extent that the Fed got nervous, because that's what the Fed uses to conduct monetary policy, right? And they were thinking, like, we need this stuff. In fact, a lot of financial institutions need treasury securities. It's the most important safe asset in the world. And the supply was dwindling because the deficit had fallen. Well, that's okay. Along came the Bush administration, and we got the deficit right back again. But you can see, I mean, there's only one blue bar above the line here, okay, and that's Kennedy Johnson. That's the Vietnam War too, as well as the Great Society. So the deficit clearly went up during that decade. But the story is completely the opposite. I mean, even the Obama administration, where you had a $737 billion stimulus package passed at the beginning of it, okay, 2/3 increases in spending, 1/3 in tax cut. By the time the Obama administration was over, they brought the deficit down to where it was before their term started. That's what this is showing. Okay, I'm not necessarily saying that was a good idea, right? And I'm just the messenger here. There's no real political point except to bust the general perception that it's always the Democrats that are causing this to go up and the Republicans bringing it down, when the truth is the exact opposite. Okay, and so chances are, who knows what the Biden administration is going to do? We got a ways to go. Now, I've got more stuff, and I'm running out of time already, I can see. And so I'm not sure where to take it. I've got stuff on interest rates. Here's some, maybe here. Is there any hope? Being the proprietor of the dismal science, it's sometimes necessary to point out the positives here too. Okay, so what's the good news? Well, this is real personal income in the United States. Real means it's been corrected for the effects of inflation. Price increases and wage increases are not really being reflected in it. It's the purchasing power. Okay, well, look at what happened. I mean, this is an average for the entire US population. Okay, the transfer payments, right? The $600 checks that were given out to everybody with income of $70,000 or less, the increase in unemployment benefits, other types of transfers that were implemented as a result of the pandemic, our real personal income is actually higher, or it actually was higher. We're right back sort of at trend now, if you can see. Okay, and so where things go from here is going to matter quite a bit for future prospects, but we just got another $300 increase in unemployment benefits that I would be willing to bet will reverse, at least temporarily, reverse any decline in this. Here it is without transfers. If we hadn't done what we were doing, okay, this is what things would have looked like. Okay, and that's a dramatic, I mean, look at that. 14,400 down to 13,200 in 1 quarter. Okay, it subsequently recovered, but again, the trajectory would be way up here somewhere. If we were continuing on the previous trajectory, we're way behind. Okay, so that's why, you know, from a very high level, that's why increased transfers are necessary. Okay, in order to continue to keep people spending, which is what we need in order to keep the economy progressing, right? Then further stimulus is needed of some sort or another, and that's what we got. Okay. The other good news is what people did with those $600 checks, right? And this is why economists typically would advocate for targeted stimulus, right? Just giving out checks, right? Well, you're giving them to a lot of people who don't really need them. My brother is actually an electrician here in Austin, and he got his $600 check, and he said he felt guilty. He just put it in the bank. I don't need this, right? He kept his job. He's an electrician at UT. He kept his job, so he's still getting paid. He didn't need the $600, right? And neither did a lot of other people. So this is deposits in checking accounts. Okay, as a result of the checks that people were getting, they're increasing. This is counted as dry powder, right? This is spending power that's sitting there waiting to happen. Okay, here's another one. This is a little bit more technical. We divide the overall money supply into M1 and M2. M1 is the liquid stuff like cash that we use for transactions, cash in checking accounts. M2 is other stuff that's a little less liquid, savings accounts, money market mutual fund accounts, and money market savings accounts. M1 is included in M2, so you got to take that stuff out. So this is just the savings accounts, checking accounts, and money market not checking accounts, excuse me, money market mutual fund accounts, money market savings accounts, and regular old traditional, what we used to call passbook savings accounts. Okay, and you can see it increased by $2 billion. It's subsequently fallen by one, but there's still about $1 billion in dry powder there that people have been saving up above what they would have saved before. So this is all, you know, a spending power that's presumably waiting to be unleashed once we get the economy back up fully running again. Now, some of these people may have lost their jobs, right? And they're not spending it as a result because they need those funds to provide a buffer. Okay, I feel like I'm running up against my time. I'm gonna say the return to pessimism is again related to something we talked about last year. And this slide, the first couple of bullets, was stolen from last year's slides. One word characterizes our current global situation. It was in small letters last year. Now it's even worse. I mean, we really have no idea where this is headed. Okay. Back then, our conclusion was the US was a horrible place to invest, right? Except for everywhere else. Okay. Returns were not really what we wanted them to be here, but we were doing better than other countries. Okay. This doesn't look like it's going to continue to be true. Yes, the stock market has continued to go up. The smart money says that's not international money. This is mostly speculators. A lot of it has been retail investors, day traders that started trading during the pandemic have apparently been a force in the stock market since the pandemic started, right? But money is not flowing in to the United States. How do we know that? Exchange rate devaluations. If people want to invest in the US globally, then they need to get dollars first. That increases the demand for dollars vis-a-vis other currencies and strengthens the dollar. The dollar will appreciate. And that was going on for years subsequent to the global financial crisis. The dollar got really strong up until right about here, as you can see, right at the beginning of this year, and it's been on an inexorable decline. This is an index of exchange rates for trading partners. But here it is with respect to the yuan. Okay, the Chinese economy is doing great. They shut down the pandemic very effectively using, obviously, authoritarian methods that we could never do here, but they were very effective. Their economy's back up and running. They're doing great. Their GDP growth came out. They were at 6.5% again. Okay, so people are going to invest in China, right? And the dollar is going to depreciate relative to the yuan. It's already happening. Same thing with respect to Europe. Okay, we do our exchange rate differently. This was yuan per dollar. This is dollars per euro. Dollars are in the numerator. So the depreciation of the dollar is reflected by an increase in the exchange rate. Even Europe seems to be a more attractive place than the United States right now, as reflected by the exchange rate. So these are votes of confidence against the US economy. We're kind of a mess. And we need to sort that out. And I think there's a lot of hope that the new administration is going to make some headway in that area. So that was probably too much material. I didn't get my timing very right. There's more here. I've used up all my time. So I don't know how you want to handle this, Larry. I apologize. I went about 10 minutes longer than I was hoping, so that I could open it up for questions. I'll stick around if anybody wants to. If anybody has any questions, I can talk about other things besides what's in the slides if you like. I'll just leave it at that.
Okay, Michael. We started about 5 minutes late, so we'll maybe take about 5 minutes for questions, and then we'll go to probably a 5-minute break in discussion. But at 5-minute break, we'll leave the mic open, so you can hang around for that. And
sure,
for
absolutely.
But we did have a question. Excuse me. We do have a question from Wimbia, excuse me, and welcome back to Wimbia. It says, what's your take on some economists' view that increased monetary supply to fight COVID will lead to higher consumer prices?
I disagree, and I think most sensible economists do. We've been hearing that since the global financial crisis. We had the biggest increases in what we call the monetary base and the M1 money supply, basically, that we've ever seen in our economy. And inflation has been below the Fed's target the entire time. So we are, as a result of this secular stagnation phenomenon that I've been talking about for two of these now, right? Inflation is not a problem unless the economy really heats up. Okay, and we wind up, demand winds up somehow breaking through the available supply, the potential of our economy, but nobody really sees that happening. Now, the pandemic may be wiping out some of our potential. So we don't have to increase spending as much as we would have in order to hit that barrier where inflation may start going up. That's I believe, a more relevant argument for the pandemic, less about the Fed and more about the fact that we may have wiped out some of our productive capacity. We don't have the ability to produce as much. So if people want the economy to produce more and the economy can't do it, prices start to have to go up. It's the same as in microeconomics, right? If people demand more than the available supply, price goes up. That works at the macro level too. That's what's going to drive inflation, not the money. Milton Friedman said 50 years ago, inflation is everywhere, always and everywhere, a monetary phenomenon, meaning all that mattered was the growth rate of the money supply for determining the inflation rate. It's wrong. It was right for a while. It hasn't been right for, actually 30 years, 40 years that relationship is broken down. So that's not what causes inflation. What causes inflation is spending above capacity. And we're not going to be anywhere near that, in my opinion, maybe in my lifetime. It's been going on in Japan since the 1990s, and we're suffering from a lot of the same forces
now. There's a couple more questions there, Larry.
Can you see the questions on the chat, Michael? Or do I need
yeah, I can do that now. Where to pull up my chat window? It's like you never know where it's going to pop up.
Read them.
I got it.
Okay.
Oops. Those are questions from Mr. Levin.
I'll ask him.
Critical is forgiving student loan debt to the future of our economy. And if it doesn't happen, when will the impact, if any, be felt?
I don't think it's a crucial part of our economy, and I don't think a lot of the economists who are advocating for it think it is either. I think it's more of a redistribution and fairness type thing. They're claiming that it's going to support the economy, but it's not necessary. I mean, this was debt that was going to be paid back over years in the future. And now, it's not like it all had to be paid back now, right? It was going to be paid back in small increments as over the next 10 years or whatever. And canceling it is certainly going to increase the disposable income of the people of that debt, but not by a dramatic amount in any short period of time. It's going to be spread out over years, and the impact of that probably won't be that dramatic. I mean, that's why our old friend that I brought up last year, Larry Summers, who some of you may know about, some consider him probably the most obnoxious economist in the world, but he's a very smart guy, and a very opinionated guy too. And he doesn't think twice about coming out and say, that's a terrible idea. We need to be worried about targeted things, not just giving blanket relief to an entire category of people, some of whom may not need it at all. Right? I mean, some of those people on student loans are, now partners at law firms, right? So why are we forgiving their debt would be his argument, right? That's not going to increase anybody's spending, which is what we need to stimulate the economy. Another part to that question, and if it doesn't happen, when will the impact, if any, be felt? Impact of student loan debt, maybe? I'm not sure I understand the question. I think I may have answered it.
Why don't we move on to the next question in sake of our time? It's from Augie. It says, in your view, how concerned should we be about income inequality from the K-shaped recovery?
I think we should be dramatic. Really, it's an incredibly important issue. The increase in inequality globally has been one of the reasons for the secular stagnation phenomena, which for those of you who don't know is basically describing the fact that the advanced economies of the world can't expect to grow and perform at the same level that we have historically. There are forces at play, demographic forces, inequality, other things that are going on that reduce spending, and spending is what drives the economy, okay? And one of the things that reduces spending is the increase in inequality. It means that resources are going to, the spending power is going to the top end. If we're in this K-shaped recovery, those people aren't going to spend it. Okay, if you give the rich people, and for lack of a better term, more income, it doesn't mean they're going to increase their spending. They don't need the increased income, right? It's not like if you're really rich and you get a $6,000 check in the mail that you say, oh, okay, I can finally go afford to buy that, whatever. Okay, whereas if you're at the lower end of the income distribution, that's exactly what you do. So we know, I mean, this is an empirical property. We know that targeting benefits, any sort of policy, any sort of stimulus should be targeted at low income people if you're trying to stimulate the economy. We never seem to do it that way, however. We have done that more so with the pandemic than we have with any of the tax cuts that have come recently. So that's only indirectly answering your question, but yeah, the bifurcation of the economy and the fact that most of the gains that have been experienced during the pandemic have gone to the top end, that's not going to increase spending. Okay, we need those resources shifted to the bottom end where people are going to spend it. That's going to drive the economy. So I think it's an extremely important problem.
Michael, you had one more question here. Steve asked, some have talked about the next decade being a lost decade. What are your views and thoughts on that?
It's, it's certainly a possibility. I have to say, I'm gonna have to punt a little bit on this. Whatever I say, it's bound to turn out to be wrong. And I don't say that from a sense of I have no clue how to analyze this type of thing. It's just that economic forecasting by its nature, that's we can't really, it's human behavior we're trying to forecast, and that's just not predictable. But certainly things don't look particularly good. I think markets have been a bit too sanguine. The stock market going on a tear like it has is probably a little bit of wishful thinking. I've been horribly wrong about these types of predictions in the past, but I would I mean, I'm certainly planning for a correction in my own financial behavior. Let's put it that way. There just doesn't seem to be any way that we can continue that rocket ship ride up in financial markets that we've seen during the pandemic, when the purchasing power of so much of our population has essentially been wiped out. It's been supported by government benefits, but that won't happen forever. And unless the parts of the economy that have shut down spring back miraculously when this is over, which nobody really anticipates, we're in for a tough, long slog. I think the prospect of a lost decade is very much in the hands of policymakers. We've spent a lot of money, and that causes a lot of anguish as we see the debt to GDP ratio go up, right? But as we've seen, even with those increases, we're still in the range of sustainability. It doesn't mean we're reaching crisis stage at all. And we can continue to be, in fact, one thing I should say is Olivier Blanchard, a very well-known macroeconomist, used to be the chief economist of the IMF, says that debt sustainability condition is currently being met by almost every country in the world. And so what he's saying is, if there was ever a time to not worry about government spending and increasing it in order to get back on trajectory, this is it. You get back on trajectory, spend the money you need. This is what Janet Yellen is going to say in her confirmation hearing for Treasury Secretary too, I understand. Do the spending you need now. Yeah, it looks scary, but not doing it is going to be a whole lot scarier in the long run. And we'll worry about, righting the ship once we're back on trajectory. I'll sort of supplement that, and then I'll shut up with you hear a lot of people who make the argument that, this is a burden on future generations. The debt that we're raising is, some of that's going to be 30-year debt that they issue. That's a burden on future generations. Well, we now have lots of empirical evidence stating that what's a true burden on future generations is when they come of age during a severe economic downturn. Their prospects are forever harmed. They never. So in other words, if you graduated and say you got an MBA in the middle of an expansion where everybody was hiring, your lifetime earnings are forever higher on average than somebody who graduated in a recession. It damages your lifetime job prospects. So that's a burden on future generations. And if it means spend the money now so we don't have that problem, that's what economists are advocating more and more all the time. And I'll leave it at that. Any other questions, I'm happy to answer, but I'm not going to, except for thank you. That's all I'm going to say unless somebody asks me something.
Okay. Michael, thank you so much for participating this year. Very, very good job. And please stick around. And we'll talk more later.
Yeah, so
we'll come back
if anybody wants to see my slides on how the stock market does better in Democratic administrations, I've got those teed up too.